It's October the 16th, 2017, a sunny Tuesday afternoon in southeast Houston, and Sam Johnson, a 53-year-old handyman, is just trying to make an honest living by fixing up a house on London Street, having no idea that in less than 10 minutes, he'll be caught in the crossfire of a war that's been raging on for years. A stolen blue Mazda speeds down the block, and before it even comes to a stop, 4 gunmen inside begin firing. The car crashes into a ditch, but the shooters don't miss a beat. They jump out, still shooting, before carjacking a woman, holding her baby, and making a getaway. When the smoke clears, Sam Johnson is dead, an innocent man killed in the gang war he had nothing to do with. A conflict between two Houston gangs that had already claimed over 50 lives since 2011. Sam Johnson's murder was about to expose something that would shock even federal investigators, because by 2017, Houston had become home to over 20,000 gang members and 400 different gangs. But to understand how Houston became a battleground where innocent handymen get caught in the crossfire, we need to go back to the beginning. Now, most people think Houston's gang problem started in the 90s with the explosion of crack cocaine, and in some ways that is true, because while some other major cities had been dealing with large street gangs since the 60s, 70s, or even earlier, in Houston, such gangs were still largely non-existent. However, the seeds of Houston's gang empire were already planted in the 70s and early 80s. At the time, Houston's black communities were dealing with the same problems plaguing urban America everywhere: poverty, segregation, and a lack of opportunities that pushed young men towards the streets. As a result, small neighborhood-based crews would begin forming in neighborhoods like the 3rd Ward and 5th Ward. They were nothing like the organized gangs we know today, but the foundation was being laid. But while cities like Los Angeles and Chicago had already developed their own gang cultures, Houston was about to become something different, a melting pot where gangs from across America would come in to set up shop. It started with migration throughout the 70s and 80s as people were moving to Houston from cities like Chicago and LA, drawn in by job opportunities and the oil industry. Some of these migrants would also bring with them the colors, codes, and criminal knowledge of some of America's most dangerous gangs. But the streets weren't the only place where Houston's gang future was being written. Inside the Texas prison system, something even more significant was happening. In 1984, the Texas Mexican Mafia would be born behind bars.
The Texas Mexican Mafia is considered a Tier 1 gang threat to our state. They got the highest rating threat to us as any gang member.
The East Los Angeles-based gang with connections to Mexican drug cartels is run like the military, according to the FBI. They have a leader who is in federal prison in Colorado. They have a constitution, and you must kill someone to get in, and you don't get out until you're dead.
And a year later, the Aryan Brotherhood would make their Texas presence known too. While throughout the 80s, a prison gang called Tango Blast was forming as a protection group against the more established gangs like the Texas Syndicate.
It was a gang to help people go home, because the other gang members were recruiting people and letting them go stab somebody.
Yeah.
Catching more life sentence, catching 30, 40 years more, just to, tell them you gotta go stab this dude. You don't even know this dude. They just tell you go stab him.
Yeah.
Texas prison gangs may seem somewhat disconnected from Houston's streets, but here's the thing about Texas. It's got one of the largest prison systems in America, and Houston, being the biggest city in the state, is where a lot of these gang members end up when they get out. By the mid-1980s, there was a perfect storm brewing in Houston, where the small neighborhood crews provided the foundation and the prison gangs provided organizational blueprints, while migrants bought the cultures and criminal enterprises of America's biggest gang capitals. Added Houston's strategic location, perfect for drug trafficking, sitting right between Mexico and the rest of America, and all the ingredients for an explosion were set to take place. But just like in other cities in America, where the gang problem hadn't yet gotten out of control, nobody in Houston seemed to understand just how big that explosion would be. By 1988, Houston had 23 gangs with 333 members, but just a year later, in 1991, that number had exploded to 103 gangs with 1,098 members, a 230% increase in just 3 years.
On Monday night, City Under Siege reporter Sherry Martinez will begin a special report on Houston juveniles who were busted for allegedly selling crack cocaine.
On a Wednesday night, a school night, yet this 15-year-old is being arrested for allegedly selling crack cocaine.
Did he sell to the undercover officer?
Yeah. He's going to be our primary delivery, I believe.
You feel this is wrong to do?
Not really.
You don't think it's wrong? Why?
Because making money.
3 other juveniles have been arrested for allegedly dealing drugs. 2 of them are brothers.
You said you've seen kids come in with large amounts of cash. What have you seen?
$700, $800, $900, food stamps, the Gucci pants.
This 13-year-old says he's sold crack for about a year, making $150 a week.
What do you buy with that money?
Clothes and, give money to my mother and stuff.
The Department of Justice took notice, sending investigators to figure out what the hell was happening in Houston. Their assessment was damning. These were young, immature, violent, and loosely organized groups, motivated mainly by the profits of drug trafficking. They would classify Houston's gangs into 4 categories: criminal street gangs, identity gangs, racist gangs, and bizarrely, satanic gangs, though the last one was probably more about the satanic panic hysteria of the 80s rather than actual devil worshipping happening on the block. But what made Houston more different from other gang cities wasn't just the numbers, it was the diversity. Houston was becoming what people would start calling the Third Coast, a gang battleground positioned perfectly between the established gang territories of Los Angeles and Chicago. Like I mentioned earlier, the gangs that set up shop in Houston brought their full organizational structures with them, and what happened next turned the city into a battlefield unlike anywhere else in America. The first wave came from Los Angeles. Blood sets like the 5'9" Bounty Hunters and 5'9" Pyrus established their territories, the Bounty Hunters repping their red and black colors and 5-point stars, while the 5'9" Pyrus repped the color red and 5-point crowns. Their main enemies, the Crips, would also make a lasting impact on Houston, starting with sets like the 5'2" Hoover Gangster Crips, who would establish their presence and bring with them the colors blue and orange. The orange was traditional for all Hoover sets, and this was the same organization that would later put a 13-year-old kid named Maxo Kream on in their set, a decision that would eventually change how Houston gangs operated forever. Meanwhile, Chicago's influence arrived with the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples, these folk nation organizations bringing their own criminal organizations to Houston's streets. But Houston wasn't content to just host out-of-town gangs, and the city would also birth some significant homegrown gangs, like the Southwest Cholos, who emerged as a powerful Latino gang, while the Fifth Ward Circle represented the neighborhood loyalty that had existed long before any colors or codes arrived. By the 2000s, authorities were tracking gangs across Houston's sprawling geography. The South Side became home to the Third Ward crews, with 103 gang, various Crip and Blood sets controlling everything from Sunnyside to South Park. The suburb of Alief became a stronghold for Latino gangs like the MS-13 and the Southwest Cholos, while the North Side saw Acre Homes, Independent Heights, and Homestead developing their own gang territories, and the East Side became prime real estate for gangs like the 5'2" Hoover Crips around Clinton Park and Federal Road. The 2000s also saw a shift that would change everything about how these organizations operated. Like in many other cities, the predominantly black gangs in Houston began moving away from traditional gang structures, forming what can be better described as neighborhood cliques.
Right now, Houston, you have neighborhoods, you have cliques. You could have a Blood and a Crip right next to each other putting in work, because it's all about the clique and the hood that you are from.
These cliques brought together members from different gangs, even traditional rivals, who were now united by geography rather than colors.
Bloods, you had a lot of Crips, some Vice Large, GDs, MS-13s.
One person who embodied this new approach was Maxo Kream. After getting put on by the 5'2" Hoover Gangster Crips at just age 13, Maxo would learn the traditional gang system firsthand. But by 2007, when he formed the Kream Clique Gang, he took a completely different approach. The Kream Clique Gang brought together members from everywhere: Bloods, Crips, Vice Lords, Folk Nation sets, and even homies from the suburbs, showcasing the new Houston model in action. For years, the Kream Clique would operate successfully, mixing criminal enterprise with Maxo's rising music career, but in 2016, federal agents would raid their operation, busting them for shipping marijuana from California to Texas through the mail. Authorities seized thousands of pounds of drugs, thousands of pills, and numerous guns.
Tonight, pounds of pot, piles of pills, guns, body armor, and stacks of cash as well. Now, all of this was seized in a drug sting against a group that calls themselves the Kream Clique Gang. And among the 8 people arrested, a Houston rapper.
Investigators say these men were using boxes just like this to ship drugs all the way across the country. What they didn't know is that they were being watched the whole time.
Maxo beat the case, but it showed how even the small neighborhood cliques weren't safe from the law. While Maxo was dealing with federal heat, the clique model would spread all across Houston in ways that were much more violent, as the neighborhood-focused approach that worked for mixed crews like Kream Clique was also fueling deadly territorial wars between rival blocks. The 100% Third Ward Gang and their rivals, the Young Scott Block, had been feuding since 2011. Both were what authorities called exclusively local and hometown groups, fighting over specific blocks in the Third Ward and Sunnyside areas. What made this conflict particularly vicious was its personal nature. This wasn't about colors or national gang affiliations, it was beef between neighbors, where geographic proximity bred intense hatred, and that hatred was turning Houston into a war zone. By 2017, this single conflict between 2 relatively small gangs had claimed over 50 lives. The violence had become so routine that innocent people like Sam Johnson were getting caught in the crossfire during broad daylight shootings.
Well, during a bar bond hearing in July for a so-called gang-related murder in Southeast Houston, HPD Police Detective Adam Bach disclosed in court there have been more than 50 deaths since 2011 related to that gang war.
This was just one feud. Federal authorities were tracking much bigger threats operating all across the entire state, threats that weren't just running operations from Houston streets, but also from behind the walls of Texas prisons. While everyone was focused on what was happening in the streets, the real power was being consolidated behind bars, where the Texas Department of Criminal Justice houses around 20% of inmates who are identified as gang members. We're talking about one of the largest prison systems in America, and inside these walls, gangs don't just survive, they thrive, recruit, and run criminal empires that stretch far beyond the prison fences. The biggest player in this system is Tango Blast, with an estimated 17,000 to 19,000 members statewide, all while lacking a centralized command structure. Instead, they operate as loosely affiliated crews based on cities: Houston Tango, Dallas Tango, and San Antonio Tango. However, this wasn't always the plan. Tango Blast formed in the 1980s out of pure survival, as Texas prisons were dominated by established gangs like the Texas Syndicate and Mexicanemi, and new inmates needed protection. But what started as a defensive alliance against these older, more organized prison gangs slowly evolved into something much more powerful. The decentralized structure that began as a weakness became Tango Blast's greatest strength, because when law enforcement takes down a traditional gang leader, the whole organization can crumble. But with Tango Blast, there's no head to cut off. Over time, Houston would become the crown jewel in this prison empire. The city's proximity to the Mexican border made it perfect for drug smuggling operations. The massive Harris County jail system became a recruitment hub, and when Tango Blast members got out, many settled in Houston, bringing their prison connections to the streets. But Tango Blast wasn't the only prison gang in Houston using the city as their base. MS-13, originally from El Salvador, would also discover that Houston offered everything they needed. The city's large Latino population provided cover for their operations. The port and highway systems made trafficking easy, and the proximity to the border meant easy access to their Central American networks. By 2018, law enforcement classified MS-13 as a Tier 1 gang threat to the entire state of Texas. They were involved in drug smuggling, human trafficking, and trafficking, and while their numbers in Houston might have been relatively small, their reputation for brutal violence was massive. Other prison gangs like Hermanos de Pistoleros Latinos and various factions were also using the Texas system to recruit and organize. The Harris County Jail became more than just a place to hold suspects, it became a networking hub where gang members from different organizations could meet, plan, and coordinate. The prison-to-street pipeline was creating sophisticated criminal enterprises with international connections, prison-based leaderships, and street operations that could adapt faster than local law enforcement could respond. Gangs offer protection to vulnerable inmates, but that protection comes with a price, a lifelong loyalty that continues long after release. And the gangsters running these operations were about to become some of the most infamous criminals in Houston history. And top of that list is Shaquille O'Neal Richards. Not that Shaq. This is a man who authorities describe as the leader of the 100% 3rd Ward Gang, and someone the Department of Justice calls one of the worst of the worst. In 2023, federal prosecutors would indict him for ordering the 2017 murder of Sam Johnson, that innocent handyman from our opening story, right from his prison cell, showing the level of organization and influence that this guy pulls. However, these individual gangsters, as dangerous as they are, represent just the tip of the iceberg, because when we start looking at the body counts from some of Houston's gang wars, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. And in 2021 alone, Houston's murder rate hit 473 homicides, with gangs linked to a substantial portion of these killings. But Houston's story isn't of course just about gangs and violence. As while the streets were being consumed by territorial wars and federal investigations, another side of the city was quietly building something that would change hip-hop forever.